the entire universe. We already covered page 11. I'd like to talk briefly about page 12. When you look, when you're looking at the picture for what things look like in the residential mortgage market, it's important to focus on two things. It's important to focus on default transition rates, and it's important to focus on prepayment speeds. Now, I should mention, we focus on default transitions rather than liquidations because, as I made you to the case, liquidations are really slow. But once you're 60 days down, you're basically cooked. So it's important to sort of look further back in the process and see what's happening at that 60-day point. And the purpose of the previous slide was basically to reiterate, once you're 60 days down, you have a very hard time recovering. Prepays are also important because if a loan is going to prepay, it's obviously not going to default. And so if a loan is in a bucket that has a high probability of default, it doesn't default this year, but it doesn't prepay, it has a reasonable probability of defaulting next year or the year after. So basically the purpose of page 12 is to just give you an idea of how important mark-to-market CLTV is, not only for defaults, but also for prepays. So what we've done on this page is divided, so let's look at, the blue line is prime loans with equity. You can see that these loans are prepaying around 16% per annum, and they're defaulting around 5% per annum. Now let's look at prime loans without equity, which is sort of the dotted line or the red line on your picture. This is prime loans without equity, prepaying around 7, defaulting around 15% per annum. All-day loans with equity, prepaying around 9, defaulting around 15. All-day loans without equity, prepaying around 3, defaulting around 30. Refinancing, prepaying or refinancing, or basically the loan is liquidated either because of a refinancing or because you paid it off in some way.
Okay.
So, and this is actually a critical concept because the loans that are paid off don't hang around to default. And when you look at a lot of these mortgage pools in the aggregate, you say, well, gee, things are fine, they're not default. There's a lot of prepayments, yes, but the prepayments are coming disproportionately from the loans with equity, and the defaults are coming disproportionately from the loans without equity. So your better loans are kind of skipping their way out of the pool, leaving you with worse quality loans over time. And so this concept that the better loans prepay and the worst loans default, I think, is absolutely critical. And it's actually very critical to understanding page 13, which may be one of the most interesting pages in this presentation. Basically, the bottom part of this is the private label universe. The middle part of this is the non-private label universe. PLS is private label securitizations. Non-PLS is non-private label securitizations. That's Fannie loans, Freddie loans, FHA loans, VA loans, and bank portfolio loans. Those 5 categories. And then the total is the total. The private label securitization information was obtained from the Loan Performance Private Label database. The non-private label securitizations were obtained from the Loan Performance Prime Servicing database, which has information on a little bit over half the loans in the universe. We grossed it up to get the right number, but the transition rates and prepay rates apply to our sample, and the total is, of course, the sum of the two. So let's look at the top part of this page, beginning at the bottom line. Now, there are 5.5 million non-performing loans. Non-performing loans, for our definition, is 60 days plus. That's different than the MBA stuff I showed you on the first page, where I used all defaulted loans. These are 60 days plus, combed from this sample. Reperforming loans, 2.3 million. Now, you can get to be, a reperforming loan is a loan that used to be 60 days down and has come back and is now either current or 30 days delinquent. So let's look at the behavior of these reperforming loans. The STR, that's the single month transition rate, 9.2%. These loans are redefaulting at 9.2% per month or 68.4% per year. They're voluntarily prepaying at 6% per year. So the default mortgages very rarely prepay on schedule all the way to maturity. Normally, they either default or they prepay. So what this is saying is about 92% of these loans will eventually default, and the balance will eventually prepay. So just it's 68.4 divided by 68.4 plus 5.9. Always performing loans greater than 120 mark-to-market loan to value. 4.8 million of these borrowers. Now these are loans that have never been 2 payments behind. What we're going to look at is the rate at which they're going 2 payments behind for the first time. 2.7% per month or 28.1% per annum. They're voluntarily prepaying at 6.5% per annum. So if nothing happens to this ratio, 81% of these borrowers will eventually default. Always performing loans, 100 to 120 mark-to-market loan to value, 4.7 million of these borrowers. These guys are transitioning into default that is going 60 plus for the first time at 1.6% per month or 17.1% per annum. They're voluntarily prepaying at 12.7% per annum. If nothing changes, 57.4% of these borrowers will eventually default. You've got 38.4 million borrowers with less than 100 mark-to-market LTV, that is positive equity as measured by LTV. These guys are transitioning into default at 5.2% per annum. Now you're probably thinking, how can loans with equity be transitioning into default at 5.2% per annum? What's wrong with your numbers? The answer is nothing's wrong with our numbers. You'll notice we're using LTV here rather than combined loan to value. The reason is we have very good combined loan to value numbers for the private label space. We don't have good second lien information on the non-private label space. So we have a hard time computing the CLTVs on those loans. So we've done this analysis using loan to value. If a borrower has a 95 loan to value and a 120 combined loan to value because of the existence of second mortgages, it's very easy to see how that number can be 5.2% per annum. If you use these ratios and you basically computed the size of the problem, you'd come up with a number like 21 million units. Well, that's really ridiculously high because you know that the default ratios are going to burn out over time. However, it seems reasonable to us, though, that that a good number of these seriously underwater borrowers who are always performing are going to default because, after all, the guys over 120 mark-to-market LTV have already been defaulting at 28.1% per annum. So you got to assume that something's going to happen, that number isn't going to go from 28.1% to 0%. So what we do is we assume that all of the non-performers eventually default. 90% of the re-performers eventually default. Out of the 4.8 million always performers greater than 120 mark-to-market LTV, most of them having seconds as well, we assume that 75% of those guys eventually default, 25% of the 100 to 120 bucket, and nothing in the less than 100 bucket. If you make these assumptions, what you find is we have basically a 12 million unit problem. And I guarantee you these numbers aren't right because assuming that nothing defaults from the less than 100 number is clearly an incorrect assumption. And the 25% and 75% kind of seem somewhat reasonable in context, but no number in here is firm, but just to kind of grasp the total size of the problem, that seems like a reasonable approach. So we're looking at a 12 million unit problem. 12 million units out of 56 million homes with a mortgage. That's basically more than 1 out of every 5 homeowners are in trouble. So you look at the size of this problem, and it's simply enormous. What I'd like